They said she was too young to remember the vows, but when the torches were lit and the doors of Westminster opened, every man in the room knew what he was witnessing was not a wedding. It was a transaction, a geopolitical sacrifice, a pact sealed with silk and skin and sovereign blood. She was 6. He was 30. And when the priest's voice echoed against the stone walls, trembling with fear and obedience, England did not gasp. It applauded. This is not a fairy tale, and the girl in the golden gown, she was not Cinderella. Her name was Isabella of Valois, daughter of a mad king, pawn in a dying dynasty, and ghost of a forgotten empire. Before she was 10, she would know betrayal, imprisonment, and the silence of a vanished husband whose crown was stolen and whose body was never found. This is not just her story. This is your story, if you've ever wondered how the innocent become symbols, and how symbols are broken to control empires. And if you're still listening, then you've just stepped into a truth they never wanted you to know. Because this isn't just history. This is the ritual of power, of possession, of sacrifice. And it begins, not with a love story, but with a crown and a lie. Let's descend. Paris, 1389. It was winter, and the Louvre did not yet house tourists or modern art. It was a fortress, cold, vast, echoing with the sharp clatter of armored boots and the stifled sobs of courtiers passing through shadowy halls. In one chamber, draped in crimson and ivory, a newborn girl cried beneath the heavy scent of frankincense and snow-damp furs. Her mother, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, clutched the child not out of affection, but calculation. This child, her first daughter, had been born under a cursed star. Her father, King Charles VI of France, had already begun to slip into madness. Days before her birth, he'd chased his knights through the forest, screaming that demons hid in their eyes. Weeks later, he would believe his bones were made of glass, refuse to bathe, attempt to kill his own brother. Little Isabella was not merely a girl. She was a diplomatic asset. From the moment she was swaddled, she was surrounded not by lullabies, but by whispers, names of dukes, ages of kings, projected dowries, and the mathematics of war and peace. Her crib was carved from political ambition. You see, in the medieval world, peace had a price, and it often wore a veil. By age 3, Isabella knew how to curtsy. By 4, she knew how to speak only when spoken to, how to nod to the Dauphin, how to walk without turning her back on the banners of her father's court. She learned not from bedtime stories, but from the screams her father made behind closed doors, the crash of goblets, the hurried footsteps of guards dragging away another nurse. What does it do to a girl to grow up watched not for her safety, but for her future value? Even her toys were chosen to mold her. Miniature crowns, tiny scrolls, dolls with royal sashes and blank eyes. She was not being raised. She was being manufactured, prepared. Because France had been at war with England for more than half a century, and kings were tired. Peasants were starving, cities were burning, and treaties sealed in blood were no longer enough. They needed one sealed in flesh. And when Isabella was 6, England sent a request, not for peace, for a bride. Across the Channel, King Richard II sat upon a throne with no heir, no queen, and a realm boiling with enemies. His previous wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died of plague. The last person who had tempered his fury, softened his isolation. His crown was heavy, his friends were few, and his enemies were sharpening their knives. So when France offered him the child queen, with a dowry that could restock his treasury and a truce that promised 28 years of peace, Richard said yes. Not out of lust, not out of romance, out of necessity. Because kings do not marry for love. They marry for survival, and sometimes they marry children. The English chroniclers wrote of the negotiations as a triumph of diplomacy. French voices called it an act of divine union. But in the quiet of the Louvre, Isabella was dressed like a doll, braided like a puppet, whispered to, like a lamb being led to something no 6-year-old could understand. The wedding would be held at Calais, English soil on French land. Safe, symbolic, neutral. Isabella would be escorted by guards, diplomats, and priests. She wore a gown woven with threads of gold, so heavy she could not walk without assistance. When Richard saw her for the first time, some claimed he smiled, others said he wept, but everyone agreed on one thing. When she reached out her tiny hand, he took it, and England cheered. But something darker moved beneath the pageantry. Because you see, this marriage, this arrangement between two monarchs, was not just about peace. It was about transformation. Isabella was no longer just a child. She was a bridge, and bridges can be crossed or burned. When the ship left Calais for England, Isabella of Valois stood on the deck, small, silent, the sea wind threading through her dark hair. The harbor behind her shimmered like a vanished dream. She had just turned 7. Across the waters, England awaited. Not a land of pageantry and joy, but of watchers, of expectations, of danger dressed in velvet. Her new life was not a continuation of childhood. It was the beginning of captivity. The coronation would be the pageant. The palace would be the cage. Because a girl does not marry a king without cost, not in a world ruled by blood and steel. The wedding at Calais had been the theater, carefully choreographed, heavily guarded, performed in the presence of 2 empires pretending this was peace. But now she was property. Isabella stepped onto English soil as a commodity, a foreign queen, too young to read the vows written in her name, too fragile to understand that behind every kind smile from the nobles stood ambition, hunger, and calculation. In Westminster, her coronation was spectacle. The streets choked with commoners craning their necks to glimpse the French child queen. Vendors sold trinkets, priests sang hymns, nobles jockeyed for position. Inside the abbey, candles flickered beneath stained glass. The crown, specially made to fit her head, was placed upon her curls. And as the music soared, Isabella barely moved. Because at that moment, she wasn't a girl. She was a symbol, a living treaty. And like all symbols, she could be repurposed or destroyed. Richard II was, by all accounts, gentle to her. He visited her chambers often, not as a husband, but as a teacher, a guide. He brought her rare birds, fine books, puzzles, music boxes. She was sheltered, yes, but not unloved. This wasn't a story of abuse. This was a story of misuse. A girl lifted above every English lady, crowned as queen, paraded to through the streets, yet held in a world where every smile was theater, every gesture rehearsed. Behind the walls of Westminster, Isabella lived in splendor, but in isolation. Her lessons were dictated, her companions chosen, her letters read. Her future was no longer hers. Because when you're a royal girl in a medieval court, they don't raise you to be a woman, they raise you to be leverage. And then, one day, Richard stopped visiting. At first, it was small, fewer gifts, shorter conversations, less laughter. Then, days without word, weeks. Isabella waited at the window, dressed in the silks he had chosen, hoping for the familiar figure to appear at the garden gates. But what she saw instead was smoke, not from celebration, from upheaval. England was shifting. The streets whispered his name. Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, his rival, his mirror. The man exiled only a year before had returned, not as a petitioner, but as a conqueror, with an army, with fire, with vengeance. And as Richard vanished from court, as his allies scattered, as nobles shifted allegiance like cards in a gambler's hand, Isabella remained in her tower room, 9 years old now, watching everything she knew dissolve into rumors and shadows. One night, Margaret Holland, her closest companion, burst into Isabella's chamber, her face pale, her voice tight. "You must leave, now." "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, her heart pounding. "To the tower," Margaret said, and even as a child, Isabella understood. The Tower of London was both palace and prison. Tonight, it would be both. The carriage that carried her through the night was unlit, flanked by silent guards. No music, no cheering crowds, no crown on her head. Inside, Isabella sat in silence. Her dolls had been left behind, her crown packed away. The tapestries of queens and saints she had studied every morning, now replaced by narrow alleys and torchlit shadows. She was no longer the Queen of England. She was something worse, a witness. And witnesses do not survive well in revolutions. At the tower, she was placed in comfort, too much comfort. Thick rugs, gentle voices, gilded curtains, and guards who never smiled. You see, imprisonment in royalty is rarely harsh, because it doesn't need to be. A gilded cage is still a cage. And as Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, too afraid to sleep, she remembered a phrase her tutor once said: "Power is not in the sword or the crown, but in who controls the story." And now the story was changing. She could feel it. She just didn't yet know how far it would fall. The next day, Richard came. But the man who entered her chambers was not the king she remembered. His hair was unkempt, his eyes hollow, his robe wrinkled. He looked more like a hunted animal than a ruler. He knelt before her and took her hand. "My child," he whispered, "you must be strong." "Are you still king?" she asked. There was a pause. Then, "For now." That conversation would haunt her for the rest of her life, because it wasn't a farewell, it was a confession. Richard was losing the war, and she, the girl sent to seal a peace, was about to become the pawn of a new regime. She had seen war from afar. Now it would take her crown and her future. Richard would vanish days later, first into imprisonment, then into legend. The rumors came swiftly. Richard is dead. No. Richard has escaped. No. He was murdered at Pontefract. No. He starved himself. No. They killed him with a blade to the head. No body, no grave, only silence. And that silence roared in Isabella's ears like the sea she had once crossed as a child. She was now a widow. At 10, a widow to a vanished king, a queen without a throne, a symbol without a purpose, but not without danger, because her value, her leverage, was not gone. It had changed, and in the hands of King Henry IV, value was a weapon. The footsteps outside her door weren't the same. Different guards now, no longer those chosen by Richard. These were Henry's men, silent, steel-eyed, and swift in their duty. They didn't bow when they saw her. They didn't smile. They watched. And the little girl they watched was no longer invisible. She was dangerous. Because a girl once crowned Queen of England, even at age 6, could never be fully erased. Not while she still lived. Not while her bloodline still pulsed. Not while the ghost of Richard II clung to the edges of rebellion like a shadow refusing to die. The man who came to her chamber next wasn't a husband. He was a victor. King Henry IV stood in the doorway of her apartments, the tower's torchlight dancing against his armor. He didn't kneel like Richard once had. He didn't soften his tone or lower his eyes. He studied her, measured her, as one would a threat. "You are still called Queen in France," he said, "but in England, we call you something else now." He didn't say what. He didn't need to. Isabella stood silently, refusing to cry. 10 years old, alone, surrounded by foreign soldiers, her husband deposed and likely dead, her crown stripped, her future held hostage. But she did not bow, because the dignity Richard had taught her, the poise, the composure, the fire, hidden behind velvet and grace, still lived inside her. The real crown wasn't on her head. It was in her spine. Henry made her an offer, cloaked in diplomacy, but forged from pressure. "You may return to France," he said, "but only if you renounce your title, publicly. You must declare before the world that you are no longer Queen of England, that your marriage is void, that Richard was never your king." The silence in that room wasn't empty, it was war. Because to a girl raised in royal courts, taught that titles were sacred, oaths eternal, and marriage the seal of kingdoms, that offer was an assassination of her identity. He wasn't just asking her to leave, he was asking her to lie. Weeks passed, each day colder than the last. The tower's walls felt closer now, Her French attendants whispered in careful tones, some urging acceptance, others warning her that agreeing would make her irrelevant forever. But Isabella was no longer a pawn on the board. She was watching the board tilt, and she wasn't ready to disappear. Word finally came from across the channel. Her father, King Charles VI, had emerged from one of his periods of madness long enough to send a royal command. Isabella was to return home immediately. No conditions, no renunciations, no public declarations. A father's will, backed by the fragile authority of a king, half mad with delusion, became her salvation. Henry blinked first, because a war with France, so soon after seizing the throne, would stretch his new crown too thin. He allowed her to leave, but made no promises for her safety. The sea crossing was stormier this time, not just the waves, but the silence. There were no songs, no celebration, no escort of loyal nobles, just a convoy of uncertainty and a queen with no realm. And when the French coast emerged from the fog, Isabella pressed her forehead to the window and whispered one word: home. But even she knew it was a lie. Paris was not the world she remembered. The Louvre's halls were quieter now, not from reverence, but from fear. Her father had returned to a catatonic state. Her mother was colder, sharper, more calculating than before. There were no soft embraces, no laughter, no safety. Because Isabella had not come home a child, she had returned a relic, a royal widow, a broken alliance, and a potential weapon. At court, she was both cherished and distrusted. She spoke French with a strange accent now, English lilt creeping into her vowels. She preferred English fashion, English food. He had lived half her life among those her people considered enemies. To some, she was tainted. To others, she was untapped power, and the French court began to whisper, could she be used? Could she be remarried? Could she be leveraged once again? Isabella heard them. The same voices that once planned her first wedding now schemed about her second. A girl traded twice for the ambitions of men. But this time, she understood the stakes. This time, she saw the blades beneath the gloves. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, took control of her future. Isabella was summoned to private councils, asked probing questions about English politics, Henry's weaknesses, the nobility's fractures. At night, she sat alone in her chamber, lit only by a single candle, writing in a journal she would later burn, just to be sure no one could use her words against her. In it, she wrote, I am no longer a queen. I am something else now. Not a pawn, not a child, but something they fear because they cannot define me. Then came the offer. A second marriage. To Charles, Duke of Orleans, her cousin. A man nearly twice her age, a scholar, a soldier, a poet, and one of the most powerful nobles in France. Isabeau framed it as salvation, a return to safety, a chance at control. But Isabella saw it clearly. Another throne, another prison, another test. This time, she didn't accept immediately. She set terms, demands. She wanted her own lands, her own household, the ability to speak publicly, to correspond without censorship, to maintain control of her dowry. A 12-year-old girl dictating her future to a court of kings. And they agreed, because now, they needed her more than she needed them. Because the former Queen of England had become a wild card in the game of empires. The wedding took place quietly. No fanfare, no thousands in the streets, no foreign ambassadors. Just vows whispered between two people who understood too well the cost of royalty. Charles respected her terms, and for the first time in her life, Isabella began to feel what power truly was. Not inherited, not given, but survived. And in that survival, she was reborn. At 13, she became more than a queen. She became a weapon, but one forged not for war, but for wisdom. A silent blade, hidden in the folds of history, still feared, still alive, still watching. And as France and England plunged once more into chaos, blood, and betrayal, she remained a symbol of what happens when kingdoms try to own little girls. They forget one thing: girls grow up, and some never forget. She was no longer called queen, not by courtiers, not by poets, not even by herself. They now called her Madame d'Orléans, and though the title sounded soft in the mouths of nobles, it bore a weight more brutal than any crown, because this wasn't a fairy tale, this wasn't love, this was a ceasefire dressed as a marriage, and Isabella, barely 14, knew it. Because when you are born into royal blood, you are born into diplomacy through flesh. You become the parchment they sign treaties on, and when the ink runs dry, they find another girl. Her second husband, Charles of Orléans, was kind, at least as kind as any nobleman raised to believe women were currency. He wrote poetry for her. He read her Latin manuscripts by candlelight. He kissed her forehead more than her mouth. It was tolerable, which for a girl who had known the Tower was something dangerously close to peace. But peace never lasts long in kingdoms ruled by madness and inheritance. Outside their chamber walls, France was bleeding. King Charles VI, her father, descended further into lunacy. Some days, he believed he was made of glass. Other days, he wandered the palace, screaming that demons were chasing him. And when a king loses his mind, the wolves circle. The dukes, the regents, the factions. And Isabella? She was now their niece, their stepdaughter, their bargaining chip. And once again, they asked her, would she marry another? Not this time. She was already wed. But her child? Yes. The child they were already urging her to conceive. Another pawn, another piece on the board, another whisper of legacy. But Isabella had learned. She had listened. She had watched men kill for power, and she had seen how queens were used not as rulers, but as silk-wrapped scaffolding to hold up a crumbling regime. So she began writing letters to foreign courts, to scholars, to women, to anyone who might listen. 10 without needing to control her. She documented the hypocrisy, the betrayal, the manipulation. She wrote in cipher, in ink made from crushed berries and soot. She hid the pages beneath floorboards, because she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preserving truth and vengeance. Then came the news that shattered her silence. England, Henry IV, dead. His son, Henry V, now king. The same boy who had once watched her from the shadows of Richard's court. The one whose eyes held no softness, only hunger. And now he was sending envoys to Paris. Not to reconcile, but to invade. Isabella stood on the castle balcony the night she read the letter. The torches below flickered like dying stars. She clutched the parchment tight, her fingers whitening, the wind tearing at her veil. They were coming for France, again. And with them came something she had buried deep, something she had almost forgotten. The offer. Years ago, before she had married Charles, Henry had proposed marriage. To her. Yes, Henry V. Before the invasion, before Agincourt, before blood drenched the fields of France, had once offered peace through union. He would marry Isabella, a queen returned to her stolen land, England's throne reconciled. And she had refused, quietly, firmly. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was this. Marriage may silence kings, but not forever. Agincourt came. The French bled, the English surged, and Isabella, now 17, was forced to watch as her country fractured once more beneath the weight of kings who saw no faces, only flags. She could have been queen again. She could have ridden beside Henry V, arm in arm, as England and France merged under the banner of conquest and diplomacy. Instead, she stood in the shadow of fire and chose something more radical than power. She chose selfhood. Not long after, the child inside her stirred. She was pregnant, not wit, a king's heir, but with a different kind of legacy. A boy. She named him Jing, and when she first held him, so small, so human, so hers, she whispered a vow into his sleeping ear. You will never be traded. You will never be sold. You will belong to no man's ambition. But the world does not care for the vows of women, and peace has a price. Before her son's second birthday, Isabella grew ill. Some say it was childbirth complications. Others whisper poison. Still others say it was grief, too many thrones, too many betrayals, too much war. She was 20, only 20, and already history was folding her into its margins. They buried her quietly. No state funeral, no trumpet, no crown, just silence. The kind they reserve for women whose lives unsettled the kingdoms that used them. Her son would grow to become a poet, like his father. He would write of stars and ghosts, of broken oaths and wounded queens, but he would never speak her name aloud. Because names like Isabella's are too dangerous, too sharp, too alive. Today, few remember her. She is a footnote, a timeline entry. Married Richard II. Married Charles of Orleans. Died young. But if you look closer, through the fog of wars and treaties, past the coronations and castles, you'll see her. Not in the stained glass of cathedrals, not in the gilded portraits of kings, but in the margins, in the gaps between power and pageantry, in the quiet defiance of girls who refuse to vanish. Because this is not a story of a queen who ruled, it is the story of a queen who resisted. A girl they tried to crown, then erase, then reuse, then bury, and each time she rose different, sharper, smarter, untamed. Some queens reign with armies, some reign with gold. But Isabella? She reigned in memory, where power can't touch her, where history fears her, where little girls still grow into women who refuse to be anyone's pawn again. They told her Charles VI was unwell, but the truth is sharper than that. He was gone, not dead, but gone. The King of France, her father, still breathed, still signed documents with a trembling hand, still wore a crown upon a head that could no longer recognize its own reflection. But the man she remembered, the one who had cradled her in satin-covered arms and gifted her dolls carved of ivory, he had shattered, like glass. And it was that very image that haunted Isabella's memory, because once, long ago, he had screamed through the halls of the Louvre that his body was made of it. Glass, fragile, breakable, untouchable. They wrapped him in blankets so he wouldn't hurt himself. They silenced the halls so the sound wouldn't drive him mad. They removed all mirrors, and they told his children, her, to smile through it. Because kings don't go mad, not publicly, not in France. But behind the golden drapes of court, reality rotted like old fruit. The queen, Isabella's mother, grew cold, not cruel, just calculated. A woman holding together a disintegrating kingdom with lace gloves and bloody nails. And Isabella? She watched it all, like a ghost walking through a house that no longer remembered its own name. Her brothers, the Dauphins, the heirs, fought among themselves. Her uncles gathered like vultures around a throne that still pulsed with power, but had no mind left to guide it. And beneath all of this, beneath the luxury and the ritual and the endless ceremonies, Isabella felt something terrifying blooming inside her. Clarity. The clarity that only comes from seeing the truth up close, and knowing it will destroy you if you ever speak it aloud. Because what is a kingdom but a story everyone agrees to believe? That the king is strong, that the queen is wise, that the court is just. But Isabella had lived the lie, had worn the silks, sat beside the madman, ched the noble's toast to the health of a man who could no longer remember their names. She had watched her own mother manipulate alliances by whispering through veils, her face always composed, always unreadable, even as her children were used like chess pieces. This was not governance. This was theater, and the script never changed. But then came something no script could predict. Her son, Jean, a boy with his father's eyes and her silence. She would sit with him at dawn, the castle still dark, and press his tiny fingers against her lips. "Shh," she would say, "listen." And he would listen, to the ravens on the roof, to the footsteps of guards below, to the wind howling through the broken chimney. Isabella was teaching him the language of power, not words, but silence. And yet, she was afraid. Because the same madness that cracked her father still slept in her blood. Because history does not care who you are, only what you can be used for. Already there were whispers. of a second marriage, a new alliance, perhaps in Burgundy or Naples. One of the dukes had joked over wine and roast pheasant that Isabella's womb had more value than the entire southern coast of France. She'd smiled, then excused herself to vomit in the corridor. She was 17 and already exhausted. She had survived the English crown. She had escaped the tower. She had buried one husband, and now they wanted her to smile again, to walk down another aisle, sign another treaty with her body. But Isabella was changing. Something inside her had hardened, a quiet rebellion, not with swords or speeches, but with awareness. She began collecting secrets. Every noble has them. Who the Duke of Berry visits at night, what the Queen drinks to keep her nerves steady, which cardinal was seen weeping in the cathedral with blood on his sleeves. Isabella kept notes, wrote nothing in her own hand. Trained her ladies to memorize conversations, sent gifts to kitchen staff in exchange for whispers. She wasn't playing the game anymore. She was preparing to end it, not for glory, not for vengeance, but because someday her son would inherit this kingdom of mirrors, and she would not let him inherit its lies. Then the fevers began, quiet at first, a flush in the cheeks, a heaviness in her limbs. The physicians blamed female imbalance. The monks blamed melancholy. Her mother blamed nothing, only tightened her schedule and sent more priests. But Isabella knew it was coming. The end. Her body, betrayed again by the very bloodline she was born to protect. And as she lay in her bed, windows shuttered, tapestries muffling the sound of life outside, she whispered to Jean every secret she could remember. Don't trust smiles. Silk hides swords. The throne is never what it seems. In her final days, she requested no procession, no public mourning, no royal announcement, only that her son be kept away from the abbots and uncles and advisors waiting to mold him. Let him be a boy, she told her maid, for as long as he can. And then she slept, and then she didn't wake. The death of Isabella of Valois was not recorded with any great sorrow. The court moved on. The queen grieved, politely. The poets offered their sonnets, politically. But one boy, hidden in a nursery, watched by a nursemaid with orders never to leave him alone, grew up with a memory not of his mother's death, but of her warnings. And those warnings? They became lines of poetry, lines that would haunt kingdoms, because Jean d'Orléans would not forget. And through him, neither would she. They dressed her in white again, but this time there were no doves, no cheering crowds, no coronation feast, just silence and silk. The French court said she was fortunate to be remarried, fortunate to have been chosen again, fortunate to still be of use. They never said the word pawn, but Isabella heard it, in the way they tightened her bodice until she could barely breathe, in the way they painted her cheeks and powdered her neck and paraded her through the hall as if she were no more than meat dressed up in gold. The man they gave her to was Charles, Duke of Orléans, her cousin, 20 years old, refined, brilliant, with poetry in his blood and ambition in his spine. They called it a union of beauty and intellect, a joining of two powerful bloodlines, a symbol of peace in a France unraveling at the seams. But Isabella knew better. This wasn't marriage. This was containment. Because too many men at court remembered what she had once been. Queen of England, the child bride turned widow, the girl who lived in the tower and walked out alive. They couldn't risk her wandering, uncontrolled, through the labyrinth of alliances and betrayals. So they chose Charles. A poet soldier with noble blood and malleable loyalty, young enough to be molded, charming enough to keep Isabella docile, political enough to absorb her significance into his own. And for a time, it worked. They shared verses by firelight. They walked gardens in the pale dusk. They conceived a child. But even in those quiet hours, in those whispered French lullabies and soft candlelit promises, Isabella felt the walls closing in again. Different language, different court, same cage. It was in the 6th month of her second pregnancy that she first began having the dreams. Not nightmares exactly, not visions of death or war or madness like her father's. No, they were colder than that. She would wake in the dead of night and feel the room had changed, as if someone had just left or something had just arrived. The windows would fog with frost, even in spring. The floorboards would creak when no one moved. Her breath would mist, even when the hearth burned high. And always, just before she woke, she would hear one word: remember. Isabella never told Charles. Not because she feared ridicule. He would have listened. He would have held her hand and recited soft poetry and blamed it on the anxieties of motherhood. But that was the problem. He didn't understand. Couldn't understand. Because Charles was still enchanted by the illusions of power, still believed that titles made men good, that banners made armies righteous, that treaties made nations loyal. But Isabella had seen behind the veil, and what she saw was rot. She began refusing visitors, avoided court functions, claimed illness, and took to the high windows of their estate at Blois, watching the Loire River churn like a slow-moving serpent. News from England arrived occasionally. Henry IV was dead, replaced by his son, Henry V, the warrior king. Isabella said nothing. The child in her belly kicked like thunder. And then came the English again. Not envoys this time, invaders. Part 15. The Battle of Agincourt. France bled, its knights slaughtered, its pride buried in the mud beneath English boots. And Charles, her poet husband, her soft-eyed companion, was taken prisoner. They dragged him across the Channel, shackled and humiliated, to rot in the same kingdom that had once crowned her queen. For 25 years, he would remain captive. 25. While Isabella, alone, twice widowed by war, a mother of children born into a kingdom devouring itself, became something neither France nor history expected: dangerous. She did not mourn her second widowhood in public. She did not remarry. She did not disappear, unto quiet convent walls. Instead, she wrote, not poetry, but letters, to Rome, to Burgundy, to Florence and Naples and Avignon. Whispers disguised as courtesies, warnings braided into etiquette. She became fluent in the language of indirect power, the kind wielded not by kings, but by those who shape kings. Isabella understood something the men around her never fully grasped, that thrones are mortal, but memory is not. And while the dukes and princes and warlords bludgeoned each other in fields soaked with blood, Isabella moved behind the tapestry, gently, gracefully, like a shadow, pulling threads. She arranged marriages for her children that spanned rival houses. She funded scholars who wrote neutral histories. She gave quiet patronage to monasteries known for their archives, not their piety. And she waited, not for vengeance, but for understanding. Because Isabella no longer cared about titles, what she wanted, what she had always wanted, was the truth. And she knew now no one would give it to her. She would have to find it herself. And when her third child died, barely 5 winters old, the fever taking him in a matter of hours, Isabella didn't weep. She sat beside his tiny, still form and whispered the stories he would never grow to learn, of kings who thought themselves gods, of mothers who became weapons, of girls who were used like ink to sign treaties they could not read. And then, when the candle burned low, she stood and left the room and never returned to it again. Because Isabella of Valois was done grieving. She had been a bride at 6, a queen at 7, a widow at 10, a wife again by 17, a mother, a ghost, a prisoner, a threat. And now, she was something else entirely, something history doesn't know how to name. By her 35th year, Isabella of Valois no longer resembled the girl who once stood trembling beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey. Gone were the braids strung with pearls. Gone was the silk and satin that once burdened her tiny shoulders like ceremonial chains. Now she wore black wool, simple, austere. Her once ivory hands bore ink stains instead of rings. Her laughter, when it came, was dry and brittle, not from bitterness, but from the erosion of illusion. She was not bitter, she was awake. And when the men of France came to her door, with their swords polished and their egos frayed, asking once more for her name, her blood, her symbol, she did not bow. She listened, she measured, and then, slowly, she smiled. Because at last they had understood what she had become. A queen not by title, but by leverage. In 1420, King Charles VI, her father, long drowned in madness, signed the Treaty of Troyes, a document so treacherous it cracked the soul of France in half. It declared that Henry V of England would inherit the French throne, that Isabella's half-brother, the Dauphin Charles, was to be disinherited, that France would, in effect, become England. It was the culmination of decades of scheming, Henry's armies, the victories at Agincourt, the political marriages, all building to this singular betrayal. And where was Isabella? Right where no one expected her. In Paris, alive, watching the world turn upside down. Again, this wasn't her war. Not directly. She was no longer queen, widow, or wife. Her children were grown, her husband long imprisoned, her name barely spoken in court. But Isabella understood something the men had forgotten. Blood doesn't vanish just because treaties are signed. Legacy doesn't die because kings do. And memory, the real kind, sharp as iron and heavier than truth, has gravity. The kind that pulls history back in to its orbit. So, she did the one thing they never prepared for. She began to tell her story. Not to the lords, not to the courts, but to the daughters, to the wives, the maids, the novices in abbeys, the scribes with shaking hands and tired eyes, the foreign emissaries' wives bored at banquets. She whispered it in kitchens and gardens, in letters passed beneath tapestries, in poems disguised as psalms. Not the story of kings, but the story of girls turned ghosts. She told them what it was to be handed from throne to throne like currency, what it meant to carry peace inside your womb while war drank at your table, what it meant to be watched, always watched, but never seen. The movement didn't have a name. It didn't need one. It spread like smoke through stone, invisible, choking, inescapable. It reached the ears of noble daughters meant to be married at 12. It reached the minds of nuns once sold to the church to pay off a father's gambling debt. It reached the heart of a boy named Charles, the Dauphin. Disinherited and hunted, born of madness and raised in shadows. When he heard her name, he didn't dismiss it. He bowed his head, because he knew if France had a soul left, it was Isabella. She never declared herself queen again. She didn't need to. When the Dauphin raised his standard in the south, it was Isabella's letters that gave him the names of nobles still loyal to the bloodline. When Joan of Arc rose, barefoot, burning with visions, it was said she carried a missive penned by Isabella herself, warning her to beware not only English swords, but French daggers. And when Charles was crowned King Charles VII, not by English decree, but by the will of a war-torn people, Isabella did not attend the coronation. She stood instead beneath an ash tree on her estate in Blois, her hands clasped, her lips silent. Not in mourning, in completion. They buried her not long after, quietly, without spectacle. No crown, no fanfare, no cathedral. Just a simple stone, engraved with nothing more than Isabella of Valois, 1389 to 1409, Queen of England. A lie, of course. She hadn't been queen for decades. She had ruled no armies, passed no laws, worn no crown in her final years. But the stonecutters didn't understand. That wasn't her epitaph. It was her revenge. Because Isabella had become what none of the kings, courtiers, or conquerors had ever dreamed she could. The sovereign of memory, the empress of untold things, the monarch of whispers. And now you, watching this, you know her name. And that is how she wins. That is how the dead live, not in marble halls, but in minds that dare to remember what history tried to forget. A girl taken from her home before her hands were big enough to hold a goblet, crowned before she knew how to spell her title, widowed before she learned to pray for herself instead of for the realm. Now imagine that girl, grown not through years, but through survival, not adorned in silk, but armored in memory, not praised by poets, but whispered about by queens. This is the world Isabella of Valois left behind, not built of stone, but of impact, not visible to the chroniclers, but carved deep into the psychology of power, womanhood, and war. And it still haunts us. History tells us she died quietly. History lies, because power never dies. It mutates. And Isabella, in death, became more powerful than she had ever been in life. Not in the halls of kings, but in the choices of daughters, not in the royal decrees, but in the defiance of bloodlines. Her memory became a silent crown, worn by those who were never meant to rise, never meant to rule, never meant to speak. Yet they did. They still do. Let me show you how. When Joan of Arc stood before the Dauphin, dressed in armor, claiming to have been chosen by divine will to save France, many doubted her, dismissed her as mad, as deluded, as dangerous. But not Isabella. Isabella, long before Joan's visions were spoken aloud, had already seeded France with the possibility that a woman could carry something heavier than a crown: truth. And it was Joan who lit that truth on fire. When asked where she drew her courage, Joan never said Isabella's name. She didn't need to, because Isabella had become a symbol, an echo, a template for the sacred rage of the silenced, not a martyr, a blueprint. And that blueprint spread like blood in water, through the courts of France, through the nunneries of Brittany, through the hidden libraries where girls learned to write in secret, copying Isabella's forbidden letters word by word into the margins of religious texts. She had warned them, in code, in ink, in breathless whispers, that the throne wasn't just a chair, it was a curse. And if they ever found themselves near it, they must wield power differently than the men who came before. Not with fire, but with precision. Not with crowns, but with choices. This is why no man ever speaks of Isabella with confidence, because her legacy can't be pinned down. Was she a queen? Yes, and no. Was she a victim? Never. Was she a child pawn, discarded when her use expired? Or was she the architect of her own legend, playing the game with a patience that outlived empires? Yes, all of it. And more. There's a detail most people miss. When Isabella returned to France, her name should have vanished from English records. It didn't. Court scribes continued to copy her name into ledgers years after her death. Why? Because somewhere deep within the machinery of kingship, there was a whisper that she might return. That somehow, the girl queen, the widow child, the ghost of peace, might walk back into history with the same unreadable expression she wore at Westminster. Not to reclaim a throne, but to remind them what it cost to hold it. And perhaps that's why we're here, why you're here, why you watched this far. Because some part of you, the ancient part, the part that remembers pain not lived but inherited, knows that Isabella's story is not about royalty. It's about reclamation, of identity, of story, of truth weaponized against silence. And now, you carry it. The story, the weight, the crown. If you felt this shift in your soul, this slow awakening, then seal it. Type below, I wear the crown unseen. I wear the crown unseen. Twice. One for memory. One for transformation. Let the algorithm know you're not asleep. You're watching. You're remembering. You're becoming.
In the cold silence after power falls, something stirs. It doesn't wear armor. It doesn't wield a sword. It doesn't stand behind banners or shout from parapets. It whispers. In kitchens. In convents. In the pages of letters burned before they were read. It's not revolution. It's infection. The kind of infection that spreads through stories. the kind that burrows into the bones of a generation and changes what they will tolerate. This is what Isabella left behind, not a rebellion, not a crown, but a virus of memory. You see, history doesn't break clean. It rots. It festers in quiet corners. It molds in the basements of cathedrals. It hangs in the breath of those too scared to speak. But the mold remembers, and it spreads. In 1431, when Joan of Arc stood on trial, accused of heresy, accused of wearing men's clothes, accused of being too much, the court scribes noted something unusual. She never wept. She did not plead. She did not beg. She simply stared, like someone who had already seen what they were going to do in someone else's life years ago. And when they lit the fire beneath her, they thought they were silencing madness. They didn't know they were reenacting prophecy, because Isabella had already burned, not in flame, in form, burned as a bride, burned as a queen, burned as a widow of 2 thrones and a prisoner of 2 nations. Her body was never tied to a stake, but her name was. Her silence was public, her mourning weaponized. They called her girl, they made her queen, they turned her into a pawn, and when they were done with her, they erased her. But you can't kill what already surrendered its name. The women of France remembered, not in open rebellion, not in battle, but in refusal. Refusal to marry young, refusal to forget, refusal to raise daughters as currency. And so the infection crept forward. In the duchesses who refused alliances, in the abbesses who rewrote chronicles, in the scholars who slipped her name into poems beneath layers of allegory and sacred geometry. She became myth, and myth is more dangerous than truth, because myth survives censorship. Myth outlives the kings. Myth doesn't need parchment, it needs only voice. Let me tell you a secret. Every generation has an Isabella. Sometimes she's a girl married before her teeth come in straight. Sometimes she's the widow locked in a tower for a war she didn't cause. Sometimes she's a woman with 2 children and no nation who looks up one day and says, "No more." She's not remembered in statues, but you can see her reflection in the eyes of those who suddenly realize they are not alone in their suffering. She lives in the long silences at family tables, in the rage behind polite smiles, in the question no one ever wants to answer. What did it cost to build this peace? And you, brother, watching this from a place they never meant to let you see. You now know the question. But more dangerously, you know the answer. They told you history was made by warriors, popes, kings. They told you women were symbols, not players. But they lied. And here's the most forbidden truth of all. Some of the most dangerous revolutions were started by women who never raised their voices. Women who carried history in their bodies. Women who were used, but never broken. Women like Isabella. So ask yourself, how many stories were never written? How many queens walked through fire without leaving ash? How many times did the world almost change and no one noticed? Until now. Because you noticed. And that is the first act of rebellion, to witness, to remember, to refuse the silence. They say Isabella of Valois died in childbirth, that she was married off again, this time at 16, to her cousin Charles, the Duke of Orleans, that she gave him a daughter, that she passed quietly, leaving behind no sons, no throne, no controversy, that she was finally at peace. But listen carefully, that's not how power ends. It doesn't dissolve into comfort. It vanishes, erased, sanitized, filed away beneath the polite lies of national mythologies. Because what Isabella knew, what she survived, was far too dangerous to allow into the next century. The official records go quiet after her death. Her correspondence? Lost. Her journals? Gone. Eyewitness accounts? Fragmented. A queen who once ruled England, whose mere presence could threaten war, is reduced to a single line in genealogies. Died 13th September 1409, age 19. No cause, no context, no legacy. Convenient, isn't it? But silence. Silence doesn't mean absence. It means fear. Fear of what she might have said. Fear of what she might have written. Fear of what she might have become. So let's ask the forbidden question. What if she didn't die? What if she escaped? What if the girl who'd been married off at 7, who'd walked the halls of kings, slept behind iron bars, watched lovers vanish and dynasties crumble? What if she slipped the chains of history itself? We know this. The Duke of Orleans was rarely with her. Their marriage was one of diplomacy, not desire. He was more interested in poetry than passion, and she was already far older than her years. Some accounts suggest she died giving birth to a daughter named Joan. But others go dark entirely, as if she simply vanished into the veil of the early 1400s, like smoke, like myth, like warning. And here's where it gets stranger. In 1410, 1 year after Isabella's death, a woman appears in Burgundy, dressed in mourning, speaking perfect English, calling herself Margaret of Stone, a name no one recognized. She refused noble titles, but she carried herself like royalty, and she spoke in riddles, of peace bought in blood, of child queens and false crowns, of towers that hide more than prisoners. Locals thought her mad, but the Duchess of Burgundy, she granted her sanctuary, quietly, privately, as if she knew exactly who this woman was. Historians dismissed Margaret of Stone as a wandering madwoman, but letters recovered from the archives of the Burgundian court reveal she was given a private residence, an income, and a special guard. She was never allowed to leave Burgundy, but she was never imprisoned either. In one note, now badly faded, a steward writes, "She walks at dawn, touching the water as if to remember. She speaks only to the birds and to a book she never lets go. That book has never been found, but fragments of it appear elsewhere. Coded language in the margins of religious texts from the early 15th century. Phrases that don't belong, names never mentioned aloud, drawings of a young queen, always with her back turned." So here's the theory. Isabella of Valois faked her death, disappeared into the protection of those who owed her more than the crown could offer, lived in exile under an assumed name, and wrote obsessively, not for fame, not for history, but for those of us yet to come, to warn, to remember, to plant seeds beneath the rotting foundations of monarchy. And maybe, just maybe, she succeeded. Because something else happened in Burgundy during that time. A wave of rebellion among the merchant women. Petitions written in fluent French and English. Whispers of a secret chapel where women gathered to read banned texts. And in one of those records, barely legible, buried beneath ecclesiastical condemnations, appears a line that has haunted scholars for decades. The Queen with no kingdom taught us to see what cannot be seen. That is not poetry. That is testimony. So why does this matter? Because it means the story you've just heard. The tale of Isabella, bride, widow, ghost, did not end with her death. It was not her death. It was a metamorphosis. She left the game they built for her. She stopped being a pawn and became something far more dangerous. A mirror, held up to the throne. So now you have a choice. Do you believe the version told by the chroniclers, that Isabella was a forgotten girl, used and discarded? Or do you believe the hidden trail she may have left behind? The clues, the codes, the quiet insurgency of truth masked as myth. Do you believe in the queen with no kingdom? If so, type it below. I believe in the queen with no kingdom. Let them know her story didn't die. Let them know you're watching. Let them know you remember. You don't stumble upon this kind of secret. You're led to it. Step by step, lie by lie. History carved away until only the skeleton remains. And when you find it, the real thing, it doesn't glow. It bleeds. Welcome to the deepest chamber, the place where history was locked away, not to be forgotten, but to be kept alive, in darkness, out of reach. We are no longer speaking of Isabella now. Not just her. We are speaking of all the others. The girl queens, the ghost wives, the child brides turned state secrets. This is the vault beneath every throne, and it was never meant to be opened. In 2016, during a restoration of a neglected section of the Louvre's foundations, workers discovered a small, sealed room. It wasn't on any blueprint. It wasn't meant to be found. Inside, one wooden chair, centuries old, facing a crumbling wall painted entirely black. No furniture, no art, no writing, except for a single phrase scratched into the stone over and over again. Je suis encore là. I am still here. No signature, no explanation, just a haunting echo from the 1400s, etched into limestone like a wound. The historians dismissed it, a servant's prank, a misdated restoration artifact, an anomaly. But linguists noticed something. The phrasing, too modern for the 15th century. The spelling, too archaic for the 17th. It was as if the message didn't belong to any single era. It floated between centuries, like a warning that kept returning. A message carved not once, but again and again, by different hands. Each time, same message, same size, same trembling curve to the letters, as if passed down, not in words, but in ritual. Then came the real discovery. Behind the black painted wall, there was a hollow space, a crawl-sized cavity sealed with mortar, centuries thick. Inside, a bundle of papers, wrapped in decaying blue silk and marked with a crest that shouldn't. T exist, a fusion of two royal seals, the lily of France, the lion of England, bound together, intertwined. No historian had seen it before, and yet it felt familiar, too familiar. Because for those who had traced the buried lives of women like Isabella, this was the signature they had only seen in theory. The emblem of the forgotten alliance. The true union, not between nations, but between the silenced. The papers inside were barely legible. Water damage, mold, ink faded to shadows. But with careful restoration, a few words emerged. He wrote me out of history. I wrote myself back in. You will not find me in the records. You will find me in the women who came after. Let them burn the books. We'll write in the walls. This wasn't a journal. It was a manifesto, an instruction manual for subversion written in a time when women were not supposed to read, let alone rebel. Whoever she was, Margaret of Stone, Isabella of Valois, or someone else entirely, she had become something larger, not a queen, a conspiracy. Here's the terrifying part. It wasn't just one chamber. After the Louvre find, similar carvings began appearing in castles across France and England, beneath old chapels, inside abandoned towers, behind fireplaces never meant to be lit. Always the same words. Je suis encore là. Hidden like veins beneath the architecture of empire, as if a network had existed, as if these women, forgotten, erased, rewritten, had been communicating, silently, relentlessly, patiently, waiting for someone to finally see them. And now you have. You, brother. This is not just a story. This is a key. And once it turns, once you see how far the silence goes, you cannot go back to sleep. Because the world you thought you lived in was built on the graves of girls who never had a chance to speak. And now, they're speaking, through walls, through blood, through you. This is why they buried her. This is why they said she died young. This is why they called it a tragic love story. Because the truth was never about a king and a bride. It was about the architecture of power, the machinery that turns daughters into treaties, the vaults beneath nations filled with the bones of silenced girls. It was about what happens when one of them refuses to stay buried and teaches others to do the same. So say it now, out loud, or in the comments. I believe in the queen with no kingdom. Once is for remembrance, twice is for awakening. This is the point of no return. You are in the vault now, and the story isn't finished. It never was.